the Rising broke out on the 24th of April 1916, a number of Dominion troops were in Ireland at the time, including Australians and New Zealanders who in the previous year had been serving at Gallipoli. The idea of the Rising was to stage some kind of large-scale demonstration that would indicate to the British government and to the Irish people that Ireland did want its own self-government. Never thought that they could defeat the British Empire, but what they were hoping to do was to have enough time to convince the British and the Irish people that this was what ought to happen.
So yes, we're in the centenary of 1916 at this stage. But if you talk about the linkages between the countries, and we can talk about those Anzacs that showed up in Dublin and that crazy complexity that goes on in these situations. When we start to peel away the layers and say, well, who are these people who are actually involved?
At the time of the Rising, it must be remembered that Ireland was an integral part of the United Kingdom. It had been part of the United Kingdom since 1801, and although there had been many attempts in the intervening time to cause a separation, those attempts were failed. So when the First World War broke out, Ireland, as a constituent part of the United Kingdom, was also at war with Germany. It had soldiers in the British Army. It recruited hundreds of thousands of soldiers to go and fight with the British Army for the Empire, for the British forces in France and Belgium. It needs to be remembered that at this time, Ireland is a part of the United Kingdom.
And we see that you have got an Anzac force, which is now seen as a seminal moment in terms of the forging of a distinct Australian identity. An Anzac force, which is the Australian Imperial Force, that lands at Gallipoli, and we all know what happens in Gallipoli in that moment, which forges this identity. But within that Anzac force, you have over 6,500 Irish-born enlisted soldiers who are taking part in this thing. Over 900 of them die there. Incidentally, over 4,000 Irish die altogether. If you can consider the other forces that have come, Connacht Rangers and others that have come in there from other elements of the British forces. So you have a significant Irish presence, not just there, but as part of that Australian force that's there at the moment of the forging of that distinct Australian identity. The Irish are there. Now there are arguments subsequently about the numbers and so on and so forth. It's not particularly important, I don't think, because the fact is that they're there. This is all laid down and discussed.
So when the First World War broke out, there was a need to raise a large number of troops, about 70 divisions over above the 4 or 5 divisions that Britain had at the start of the war. A number of those divisions were raised in Ireland itself. There was the 10th Division, included both Catholics and Protestants, Northerners and Southerners. The 16th Division was mostly nationalists from the south, and the 36th Ulster Division was almost exclusively Unionists and Protestants from the north. In Australia, we had almost a replication of the United Kingdom here in Australia just before the First World War. We have English, Scottish, Irish, Welsh people making up well over 90% of the population. So you have in Australia a divide, and in a sense, between Irish Catholics. You have then British Protestants made up of English Anglicans, Scottish Presbyterians, and Scots-Irish Presbyterians. So you have a replication of what was the ethnic makeup in the United Kingdom at the time. And prior to the First World War, there was sectarian tension in Australia, largely over issues such as funding for Catholic schools, and also over the issue of Home Rule for Ireland. In 1914, the situation was very tense. In fact, Ireland was sliding towards civil war over the Home Rule issue. The Protestants of the north, in Ulster, were vehemently opposed to Home Rule, and they had formed a militia called the Ulster Volunteer Force, which was pledged to prevent Home Rule coming into force. In response to that, the nationalists in the south formed their own militia called the Irish Volunteers. So that in 1914 you had two forces that had obtained arms, each of them had obtained arms from Germany, of all places, and you had two armed camps that were ready to fight each other. The politicians were finding it very difficult to find a compromise to prevent the civil war. But what happens is that the war, when it breaks out, acts as a circuit breaker. It was fairly well accepted that it was in Australia's interest to fight in this war, because if Germany were to win, then Australia's security could be threatened by a resurgent German empire. So Australians did join, and many no doubt joined for ideas of fun, an overseas trip, earn a bit of money, camaraderie, peer pressure, no doubt many reasons for why people enlisted. Come Easter week, we have a situation where you have large numbers of Australian and New Zealand troops, Anzacs, many of them veterans of Gallipoli.
And then you see that intertwining, that overlapping of identities and involvement, which happens again in 1916, and people are very surprised to learn that there are these Anzacs who happen to be on R&R in England or in Ireland at the time, and are pressed into action because of the uprising at Easter, and some of them, of course, famously end up as snipers on the roof of Trinity College, and the stories around that have been told.
So the Australian and New Zealand soldiers who were in Dublin probably thought that they were well away from the fighting and well out of it, but soon they were to find that they would be right in the middle of it, and instead of fighting Germans in the fields of France, they would be fighting Irishmen in the streets of Dublin.
Uncle Mick would have been in Dublin just one day before the Easter uprising on the March the 25th, 1916, and he would have been dressed in the army uniform. As I understand the situation, there were shots fired in his direction with the men that he was with, two other soldiers apparently, Australians. So they had to scamper for protection one way or another, physical protection. And as such, they were near the Trinity College at that stage, and that's where they were taken in for protection, as other people from the streets were doing the same thing. They would not have had weapons, no, and like in those days they wouldn't have had revolvers or anything at all. So he would have been completely unarmed. Once having entered Trinity College precincts, however that would have been established, they were then recruited and probably even volunteered to take up positions to defend the college, which seemed to be a prime part of interest for the prevailing government at that stage. I understand that Uncle Mick became a sniper up on the roof of Trinity College. There was some level of movement on the streets below, and one of which was a dispatch rider, Gerald Keogh, and Gerald was shot.
When we look at the shooting itself, it's quite sad. The Anzac reports suggest that when the shots rang out, and there were about 5 shots, Gerald continued for about 30 yards on his bicycle. In fact, some of the Anzacs thought they had missed, and suddenly he swerved and the bike went and he fell. At that stage, the Trinity College opened the doors of the Provost's house, and they brought in both the body and the bicycle, and they found on him ammunition, quite a lot of ammunition, 2 rifles, and some say dispatches. Now, unfortunately, I haven't been able to to trace those dispatches. But we do know that he was returning to the General Post Office, out of which he had come the day before, and it was Patrick Pearse himself that had given him the orders.
He could have been very competent with a rifle and, fairly accurate. No, I think that for Uncle Mick, he was in a situation which required him to take particular action, and he did that as it would be more a survival instinct, but also a sense of responsibility. But in that sequence, he would have been more being conscious of surviving than defending the college.
But there was a medical student in Trinity called Taff, and he happened to see the body after it was brought into the Provost's, the garden of the Provost's house. And he said he had one wound in the temple. And Professor of Geography came and saw the body a little while later, and he saw one side of the head was congealed in blood. So it seems that it was an entry-exit wound. And I was talking to somebody of the Irish Army to try and get a handle on exactly what was the truth here. And he was telling me, look, if you have moving targets coming along in the first light of dawn, it's extremely difficult that more than one shot would have got him. It was almost an accident.
Some 3 months after the event, there was an awarding of I'll call them tokens, but they could have been trophies, to the whole number of people who were associated with the defence of Trinity College. Uncle Mick at that stage had moved. He would have been awarded a replica of the main prize, and it would have been a silver cup. Uncle Mick was over in France at that stage and did endeavour to be able to get back for the presentation, but that was not possible. I do understand that he gave out an address for the cup to be forwarded, and I imagine it would have been to him in France as opposed to going back to his mother in Australia, because none of the relatives who would have known about that had any knowledge of it after I questioned, after reading about it in Jeff Kildere's book.
So if you take it as two seminal moments in the construction of two separate identities, an Australian one and a moment in the Irish context on seminal moment on the road to independence, you see that the Irish and the Australians are overlapping and interlinked. They are involved in one another's stories. And this is what plays out. Once you start this conversation here in Australia, as we have done over the past couple of years in the lead up to 2016, and now throughout this year, the level of knowledge, enthusiasm, awareness and interest is out there. It's not simply academic. It's quite real because it means something to people. They know the people. You know, we have relatives of participants in the 1916 Rising who are in Australia, the descendants, relatives and descendants of relatives who are here.
Today, Anzac Day, we're having a family reunion, the Keogh family reunion in Trinity College, and members are coming from New Zealand, from the United States, the United Kingdom, and obviously from Ireland itself. And our purpose here is to remember our ancestors. And as part of this, we would endeavour to remember Gerald as part of the Keogh family. But not only that, to give his death a significance and a meaning that will last for a long time, and hopefully will indicate to people who are at war that there is a meaninglessness to it, and why can't we talk before we actually take up the gun? It is fitting then that as we remember Gerald, we invited Patrick McHugh to join us. Patrick's grandfather is nephew of Anzac Michael McHugh, who was on the roof of Trinity College that morning and reputedly fired the fatal shot. Patrick is here. I'm very welcome, Patrick. this reputation that Michael McHugh was the one who fired the fatal shot is reinforced by the song Digger in Dublin. It's Michael McHugh's lament for killing Gerald. So we also invited Kevin McCarthy from Australia, singer-songwriter, to accompany us today.
A digger there in Dublin at the dawn of Anzac Day. We stormed the beach at Gallipoli a year ago today. My name is Mick McHugh and in Cooktown I was born. My parents sailed from Ireland to Queensland's sunny shore.
And when the drums of war rang out, I was barely 21. In the name of king and country, volunteered to fight the Hun. I joined the 9th Battalion, sailed for Gallipoli. Saw the senseless slaughter, I saw cold brutality. And though we gave it all we had, in the end we failed. Left our fallen mates behind beneath a foreign grave. Those of us who survived were shipped
accompanied
to
by
England shore,
Gerald's great niece Mary to proceed to unveil the plaque now, please.
And some of us with Irish blood took leave of our command. Anzacs from Australia back home in Ireland. But fate's a cruel commander and not one of us could know that Easter Monday morning at the Dublin GPO, Patrick Pearse would take a stand, tear down the Union Jack, raise an Irish flag and proclaim an Irish state. The British stormed into Dublin town, no rebel would go free.
I believe it was my great-grand uncle Mick. He was an Australian digger fighting over in World War I, and he was on furlough at the time, and him and a couple of the other Australians with Irish heritage decided to come back over to Dublin just whilst they were on leave, rather than going to England or Egypt that a lot of the rest of the Australians did. And little did he know that at that time the rising was going to occur, and being an Australian, he was still had to serve under the King and Crown. And so when they requested these Australian soldiers to take up arms, because a lot of the English and British soldiers were obviously overseas in mainland Europe fighting World War I, he was asked to come and help, and he begrudgingly did, but he did what he thought was right as an Australian, still having to serve under the King. And it was early one morning. He was on top of Trinity Tower, and he saw a messenger riding through trying to deliver a message between rebels, and he shot him. And so here today I've been called back by the family of the deceased.
Away beneath this Queensland sun, because I shot that Irishman, the King gave me a prize. Now hidden underneath my bed, that silver chalice lies. I fought upon the fields of France, I fought at Anzac Cove. They tell me I'm a hero, but no one will ever know. I could never tell my family the shame I felt within when I shot Jerry Keogh in the service of the King. A digger there in Dublin at the dawn of Anzac Day stormed the beach at Gallipoli a year ago today. I could never tell my family the shame I felt within when I shot Jerry Keogh in the service of the King. No, I never told a single soul the shame I felt within. I shot Jerry Keogh in the service of the King.
Thank you. Most appropriate closure.
We have participants, or a participant in particular, who was buried here, and whose grave we have marked out and commemorated again this year, and all that goes to show that, again, there's the proximity between us. The gap, any gaps that exist are simply gaps in the tyranny of distance. But beyond that, we are a people who share not just values and views of the world, but we've considerable shared DNA as well.
God.